Did Joseph only use the Nephite interpreters for the translation of the Book of Mormon? And is it really conspiracy theory that Joseph never used his own personal seer stone hat?
Yes. Yes, it is. And I even gave 2 examples in that original video, which he conveniently left off.
Even President Russell M. Nelson himself acknowledges that this view of Joseph using his personal seer stone
and I even addressed that point. So when folks like to pull out the video from 2020 with President Nelson sticking his head into a top hat and saying that's how the translation was done, it's very clear evidence that President Nelson was more influenced by the scholars than the other way around. Now, he does go on to point out that the term Urim and Thummim didn't really start entering into church cultural lexicon until 1833. Now, he's absolutely right there. There's no instance of that happening beforehand. However, the assertion that he makes is that it was an attempt to cover up Joseph's past with a more magical worldview, something that wasn't even part of any kind of history related to Joseph Smith prior to the 1980s, but I'll get to that in a bit.
Now, this article does go on to state correctly where the preponderance of evidence leads us to, that Joseph also used one of his seer stones for convenience during the Book of Mormon translation. Other sources corroborate Joseph's changing translation instruments.
Now, this is where dishonest historical inquiry, at least on the part of No Sacred Cows, is fully on display here. You'll notice he never actually goes to the footnotes, which is usually the case for people who try to throw this out there. Now, admittedly, this does require a bit of effort on some people's parts, which admittedly many are too lazy to do, but don't worry, I got you. Now, what I want you to notice here is that these sources don't point you to go to the primary sources itself, but go to other external works. This is the same thing of what we see with the Gospel Topics essays, and even within the Joseph Smith papers itself. Notice further that these are not the actual primary sources that are being directed toward, but commentaries about what these primary sources allegedly assert. And that's the issue. These are commentaries about what these original sources allegedly assert. This is not what the actual primary documents ultimately show us.
Now, I think the most straightforward way to look at this is that during the first part of the Book of Mormon translation, the 116 pages which were lost, a lot of that's pointing to Joseph actually using something like the Nephite interpreters. But then for the remaining of the text we have today, starting in Mosiah on through the end of the Book of Mormon and then back to the beginning, up through the Words of Mormon, right, that Joseph was entirely using his own personal seer stone in a hat. That's again where the evidence leads.
Only if you stop there, because there's far more evidence to suggest that Joseph actually got the plates and the interpreters back, not just from Joseph himself, but from several of his contemporaries. In fact, the only one to make the assertion that Joseph never got the plates or the interpreters back was David Whitmer, and this was in an effort to make Joseph's character seem as incredibly shady as possible.
Now, this is the one bit of information that I think Latter-day Lion is not even thinking about, or maybe he's just not bringing up to you, the fact that the Nephite interpreters, right, where did Joseph get those? He got those with the plates, right? Now, when Joseph was done with the translation process, according to Joseph Smith himself, and then also according to Brigham Young, that at the end of the translation process, that the plates and the interpreters were given back to the messenger, right?
Well, it wasn't just Joseph and Brigham Young that testified to that. Each of the 3 witnesses in particular, especially since they were the ones who saw the messenger as well as the plates and the interpreters, all testified that they were with the messenger to this day. But that's really the long and the short of it. When it comes to looking at historical documents, it is important to recognize that first-hand accounts tend to be more trustworthy, especially if there are other first-hand accounts that are consistent with them. Second and third-hand accounts can be profitable in a sense, but again, we're looking for that consistency, and that's where the seer stone narrative ultimately falls apart. And this is why I say those claiming the seer stone and the hat story to be more legitimate, to be more the conspiracy-minded theorists, than those that believe Joseph, Oliver, first-hand accounts from Martin and others that suggest that Joseph exclusively used the plates and the Nephite interpreters. And this is where truly honest inquiry, when looking at things from a historical perspective, needs to come into play. We shouldn't be relying on commentary or anything of the sort. We need to be looking at the primary sources.
So what's the matter with this stone? Well, first of all, this stone, Joseph's original seer stone, is also tied with his pre-Book of Mormon practice of being paid to act as a scryer for treasure digging, right? Treasure digging is something that both he and his father both believed in and participated in, right?
Wrong. In fact, after the Book of Mormon was published in 1830, Joseph gave Oliver the stone, saying he had no use for it anymore. And given Oliver's statements about Joseph's exclusive use of the interpreters and the plates, as well as verified first-hand statements from Martin while he was scribing, it suggests that Joseph, while he did have the stone, used it for something else, not necessarily to receive revelation or to translate the Book of Mormon, but it does lend credence to the demonstration theory.
Now, here in this Joseph Smith 1826 trial, and again, this is on the church website, it says here that Joseph readily agreed he'd use his seer stone to look for lost property, right? Lost property is the euphemistic term that the church is using here to refer to buried treasure, right?
Again, wrong, or at least in how he's presenting it. Now, this is the only evidence that we have that the trial, or really in reality, the hearing even took place. And there are several people that claim that they were there. However, again, looking at the consistency of the accounts, they don't really line up all that well. So based on this document, what can we really assert? That this really was just a nothing burger in the end. If it really was as damning as what No Sacred Cows is trying to assert here, then this would have been implemented in other early anti-Mormon materials, not the least of which would have been Mormonism Unveiled as far back as 1834. And yet, it's conspicuously absent from that volume.
Joseph was paid to do this work. And this is something that Josiah Stoll himself actually believed that Joseph had the ability to do, despite the fact that they never actually found any buried treasure.
Yes, and you know who told him to stop? Joseph, even by Josiah's own admission.
So, the question I pose here is, why would God have Joseph use a seer stone for the Book of Mormon translation process, something that was also used in a prop in something that was either a false belief that Joseph had, right, this magical worldview, or was a prop in Joseph actually defrauding people for money?
The answer is very simple. He didn't. In fact, you read the Doctrine and Covenants, you would know just how important the Nephite interpreters were in the Book of Mormon translation. And even if you don't necessarily think that the Doctrine and Covenants is revelation from on high, as in the words of the Lord, they would still fall into the category of what Joseph ultimately said about the translation process. I mean, going to Doctrine and Covenants 17 alone shows what the three witnesses were going to be shown. Conspicuously, there is something absent.
And granted, whether Joseph believed in this genuinely or not, he was paid to use his personal seer stone for these treasure digs. He made money off this.
Sure, but not a lot. In fact, he was noticing that Josiah Stoll was losing a lot more, which prompted him to get the man to stop.
And I think when it comes down to it, that's one reason why we don't want to associate this seer stone with the Book of Mormon translation process, because again, it becomes the bad tree that's supposed to bring forth the good fruit.
That's part of it, but another part is choosing to believe inconsistent second and third hand sources that, admittedly, weren't even there to begin with. Take David Whitmer, for instance. He's one of the primary sources behind the popularity of the Stone in the Hat translation theory. The problem is, when looking at all of his interviews from the 1870s until his death, he contradicts himself no less than 17 times, not just on what the stones looked like, but what he used when, and a whole bunch of different inconsistencies.
Now, let's just for a minute take a small tangent and just realize that Joseph's seer stone wasn't the only magical prop that was used in the translation process for the Book of Mormon. In D&C Section 8, we have Oliver Cowdery wanting himself to be able to translate the Nephite records, right? Now, Oliver Cowdery here, he's not trying to use any sort of Nephite seer stone. What is Oliver Cowdery wanting to do here? And what does the Lord allow him to do? Now, I should note, this is D&C Section 8 before it's been edited and changed by the church, because here it's very clear the method of translation that Oliver Cowdery wants to try. And that is here where the Lord tells him that Oliver Cowdery has a gift of working with the sprout. What does it mean to work with the sprout? Okay, he goes on to say that that God can cause this thing of nature to work in your hands. Okay, what is this referring to? This is referring to Oliver Cowdery's belief in his ability to basically use a witching rod or a divination rod, something used to find water. Oliver Cowdery wanted to use the same thing to be able to divinate or whatever in the Book of Mormon translation process, right? And this is something that apparently through Joseph Smith, God endorsed Oliver Cowdery using this magical object to translate all those ancient records.
Now, yes, Oliver Cowdery did have divining rods. However, this was actually retranslated. Now, yes, Oliver Cowdery did have divining rods. The problem is that the way that No Sacred Cows is trying to assert is that this was how everybody asserted things. The problem is that when Sidney Rigdon changed sprout to rod in the Book of Commandments, it was meant to be more in line with Moses' staff in the Book of Exodus. And again, this kind of lends a little bit more credence to the demonstration hypothesis when it comes to Joseph's use of the stone in the hat, rather than the actual translation method itself. Because keep in mind, Joseph was not allowed to show the plates or the interpreters to anyone unless and until he was given explicit permission to do so.
Now, did it work? No, because we see the next section, D&C section 9, where God says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Oliver Cowdery, you are no longer going to translate. You took no thought, was it safe to ask, and you should have studied out in your mind," right? Your using of the divination rod, working with the sprout, right? It didn't work. So we're going to go back to Joseph's gift, right?
Yes, never mind the lesson that Oliver was supposed to learn, especially during this time when he said these were days never to be forgotten.
Okay, so back to Joseph's actual seer stone. One thing I think everyone will notice as you go through and you read the Doctrine and Covenants, many of the headings, it will say that Joseph has attained this revelation through the Urim and Thummim, right? If any of those revelations happen after the Book of Mormon translation process was completed, and a lot of them were, what Urim and Thummim...
That's just plain false. There's only 9 revelations that were received through any other instrument besides direct revelation itself. And those were all given through the Urim and Thummim prior to April 1830, when the record and the Urim and Thummim were given back to Moroni. This is just plain dishonest.
We also see for the Book of Abraham that it was actually used in the Book of Abraham translation process. Now we see this more just in...
This is one of those things that's ultimately difficult to authenticate, and honestly needs to be taken with a grain of salt, simply because there's no other first-hand accounts for it. And given the fact that Wilford Woodruff is often the one pointed to for this, Orson Pratt does say something similar to it in the Journal of Discourses, but there's no other evidence of those who actually witnessed the translation of the Book of Abraham that suggests that Joseph used any instrument at all. So, again, this maybe not, needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Time of the Kirtland area, where the Kirtland time when Joseph is working on the Book of Abraham translation process, we don't have evidence of Joseph using a seer stone during the Nauvoo period of the translation process. But in that article from the church, again, talking about the Book of Abraham translation process, it said that Wilford Woodruff himself said that Joseph would translate through the Urim and Thummim ancient records and hieroglyphics as old as Abraham or Adam. So again, Wilford Woodruff is also, he's one of the faithful people that testified to Joseph using his own personal seer stone. I know there's another person that is considered to be an adversarial source, but he talks about Joseph actually restoring some characters in the papyri by using his seer stone in a hat.
Now, the reason why we do need to ultimately take this with a grain of salt is primarily, one, because Wilford Woodruff wasn't really a witness to Joseph Smith translating the Book of Abraham. A lot of what he got came from secondhand sources. Those that actually witnessed Joseph translating never said that he used anything other than the scroll. And this is where things ultimately come, really full circle in this sense. Because, yeah, there were a lot of people that, the Urim and Thummim are stones in and of themselves, but they were described as being white and placed in the rims of a bow. The problem is that, by the time Joseph was getting close to the end of the Kirtland era and even into the Nauvoo era, Urim and Thummim was so ubiquitous with so many things that it really was difficult to ascertain what actually he was referring to a lot of the time. But that's also why, in later years, when Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and others spoke of the Urim and Thummim, they were very clear to point out and clarify right afterward, or as the Nephites called them, interpreters.
Latter-day Lion, you can call names, you can say it's just a giant conspiracy theory to believe that Joseph ever put a seer stone in a hat for the translation of the Book of Mormon, right? Let's pretend that's true for just one moment. Let's just step into your delusion on this. That Joseph only used the Nephite interpreters for the Book of Mormon production process. you still have to realize that in Joseph's treasure digging that he was paid to do, that he admitted to it in court doing, and then later on for later sections in the Doctrine and Covenants and also the Book of Abraham process, that this was a time when Joseph was using a seer stone to do that. And guess what? He didn't have the Nephite interpreters anymore. What did he had? He had his own personal stone, the stone that is still in the hands of the church today.
The problem is that, as has been pointed out, there's a lot of things that No Sacred Cows makes in this video that are just plain wrong and relying almost exclusively on commentary based on information that hasn't really been new in the last 60, 70 years. All of the information that we have regarding Joseph Smith's translation process, the seer stone, the Urim and Thummim, whatever, nothing new has been presented. Again, back what I mentioned earlier, this didn't really start gaining in popularity until the 1980s. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, folks like Richard Turley, or really the mentors of Richard Turley, were heavily reliant on documents that ultimately made it okay to look at sources that weren't even trustworthy in their own time and then make assertions based on other statements like from Wilford Woodruff later on. The thing is that none of this, again, is ultimately new. It's a different interpretation and is the one that's currently in vogue. And the issue that comes with it is, what is ultimately the consistent narrative? When you look at the first-hand accounts, when you look at those that were actually a witness to the Book of Mormon translation, the consistency comes from those who were first-hand eyewitnesses. Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, verified first-hand accounts from Martin Harris, as well as the Lord and the Doctrine and Covenants. But if we want to take the assertions of folks like Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, E.D. Howe, David Whitmer after 1838, then yeah, sure, the stone in the hat may have been plausible. But again, if you were to take those statements, you would have to reconcile the fact that they are ultimately inconsistent, not just with what Joseph used and when, but also what they looked like. So, look, in the end, the consistency with Joseph using the Nephite interpreters is there. The consistency with the stone in the hat isn't. Sorry, bud. That's just the way it rolls.